All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Try to get started on time. Last week, we kind of talked a little bit about, was our last section on the theological foundations, where we're really trying to lay a good foundation for why we're going to practice what we're going to practice. And so now we're transitioning into the practical implications. So because of our child's spiritual state, because we need to get at their heart, and because of the reality of us trying to uphold the law and communicate mercy and grace, because of all that theological foundation, practically now, what does it look like to actually have that conversation with our kids and actually carry out this discipline in a faithful way, faithful as it relates to the principles and things that we've learned so far. So we're really going to get into the thick of the practical and what it looks like to actually have a conversation like this with your kids. But before we get there, I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity. We had to finish up really quickly with kind of talking about how discipline doesn't just serve as a punishment, but how I'm kind of articulating it as also a warning. And I know that's probably new for some of you to kind of think about it in those terms. And so I wanted to give you guys a chance to ask questions if you had any. I know Chris had asked a question last week that I'll address, but if any of you others have any questions or thoughts along those lines, the reality of upholding the law, communicating grace, and then how that, how discipline is supposed to be communicated as a warning to our children. Any thoughts or questions on those realities? Okay. Yeah.
Throw it out there. So, like isolation as a punishment.
Okay.
Yeah, timeout and so forth. So if you look at, there's a whole lot of behavior that you can address by saying, if you continue to do this throughout your life, you're not going to have friends and relationships if you act this way. So we're going to give you, the opportunity to experience isolation and what that's like. Is that the type of thing you're talking about, or is that not a good application of that?
Yeah, and as you'll see today, when we walk through some scenarios, is you actually, when you communicate your discipline as a warning and not simply as a punishment, it gives you the ability to contextualize your discipline. So as to say, I have an illustration in here later that we'll see of I'm taking these toys away from you because they've obviously caused your heart to flare up and your sinful desires to flare up, and you've expressed yourself poorly in relation to them. And I might articulate the taking away of the toys as pointing to a spiritual reality, that like the presence of these toys being removed should help you understand that eventually the grace and mercy of God extended to you is going to be removed. And if you continue to walk in rebellion against him and continue to not seek Jesus' help with your heart, there's going to come a point where that mercy and grace is going to be removed. And that's when you die. There's no second chances after you die. And so it does allow you to specialize and contextualize the discipline and the way you describe it to your kids. Because ultimately with our discipline, we want them to be linking it to a spiritual reality, and we want them to be linking it to a warning of what's going to come. And so I would say that the illustration you gave might not include the spiritual side, although that's a very applicable thing. Like I tell my kids all the time, like, look, there's going to be punishments and consequences in this life that you're going to experience for living the way you do. Like if you just punch somebody, that's assault. Like you're gonna get put in jail for that probably. Like there's going to be physical consequences, but we continually, I think, want to be pointing our children beyond that to a spiritual reality. And I mean, I've told my kids before, like, you're not going to have any friends. Like, nobody likes somebody who acts this way, things like that. But I think that we want to prioritize incorporating spiritual realities into it, if that makes sense. Another question that was asked before along the lines of just in a personal conversation that I wanted to address was specifically with discipline being a warning. The question was, how does viewing discipline in this way as a warning of what's going to come in terms of God's judgment, how does that help to draw our kids near to God rather than just make them afraid of him? And that's a really good question. And one of the things I would say is that we have to understand that a fear of God is actually a really healthy thing. And the Bible talks about that reality. The Bible talks about how we should only fear God, that we shouldn't really fear anything else, but only fear the one who has the authority to deliver us over to hell, right? That's what the Gospels say. You shouldn't fear man, you should fear God. Now, there's obviously a way in which we can present God as being just a angry monster in the sky, which isn't healthy for our kids. But that's how we need to balance that conversation with the grace side and communicating the gospel to them. That although God is righteous and holy and he will punish you if you continue to reject him, he's made provisions for you in the gospel. And that's where you get to really talk to them about that reality. And the other thing that I would say along those lines is that when we don't point our kids to a future reality and a spiritual reality, we're just making them afraid of us. That's all that we're doing. When we punish them, when we discipline them, when we spank them, when we do things to them, and we don't link it to a spiritual reality and to their relationship with God, all we're doing is making them afraid of us. And I think that that's really unhealthy for our relationship with them. And then ultimately because you're not even including God in the equation, and so how can they foster and build a relationship with him? So that's probably the way I would answer those two things, and it could be fleshed out in greater detail. But I think that it's a healthy thing that we're creating a sense of reverence and fear for this holy and righteous being, but then also communicating the side of his love and mercy and compassion, and how this discipline is actually an expression of that, because it's serving as a warning. It's not serving as a final punishment for you now. It's serving as a warning of that reality so that you will turn to Jesus now while you still can. And so I think that it's consistent with giving our children a healthy fear of God and turning, again, including God in the relationship with our children that we have with them. Okay, so let's jump into today so we can make sure that we get through this. So I told you where we came from with upholding the law, communicating grace and mercy, discipline as a warning, communicating it in that way. We'll see how to do that effectively today. And so our fifth principle that we come to is communicating the gospel is the chief end of corrective discipline. And so today and next week, we're just going to be looking at what the actual steps look like, and then giving examples of how this actually works itself out in given scenarios. And so we'll handle one scenario today. We'll handle two next week, hopefully. Excuse me. I gave you a little handout, a little sheet there, and that's a take-home for you, where you can utilize that. It has all the steps that we're going to cover today to say, okay, let me really think critically about what's going on in my child and how best to communicate the gospel to them. And so you can use this as a quick little fill-out sheet, or even if you're like, hey, my child's doing something and I need some time to think about how to communicate to them and what their heart is and how the gospel speaks to it, you can use this as like, look, I'm going to deal with this later, and then you go and spend some time trying to actually think critically about the conversation you're going to have with your kids. And so that handout has all of the steps where you can kind of fill in the way you're going to handle it with them as you prepare for that conversation. And as you do this more and more and more, it just becomes pretty natural, and you won't have to take the time to write out your answers and the different things that you want to communicate. You'll just kind of have them memorized, because with most of our struggles, they're just repeated sins, right? They're repeated same heart issues, and they need the repeated same gospel realities preached to them. So let's first start by looking at this conversation, generally speaking, before we look at the scenario. And so let's first look at the steps of the process of communicating the gospel through our corrective discipline. So the first step that you have on there is to pray, and I put quickly in parentheses. This is a prayer for you as a parent, that when you hear like somebody just laid the smack down on somebody else in the other room, you hear the cry that follows it. you're thinking, okay, I got to get over there quick before the crier retaliates. But I also don't want to go into this just in my own strength, right? I want to be patient, I want to be loving, I want to be kind, I want to be gracious. So this is a quick prayer that is often in my mind that sounds like, Jesus, help me, help my heart to handle this right as I go into the situation. This is not an insignificant prayer. It really sets the process off on the right foot of you resting in the power of the Spirit to handle the situation. The second thing that you need to do is to find out what happened. Don't assume you know what happened. Have a conversation with them. You're the judge here in this court hearing. What happened? Well, he hit me. And why did he hit you? And, figuring out the logistics of what happened in the situation so that you know how to address each party. The third thing you want to do is get at the heart. And this is one of the most important things about the entire process, because it's, again, going to give you a window into their desires, which is ultimately what you're going to apply the gospel to. So 2 things that are helpful in this regard is ask them specifically why they did what they did, okay? Ask them not just what they did, but why they did it. And this is going to give them an opportunity to realize that, again, they're more than just their actions, that something is going on inside of them that is producing those actions or words, whatever it might be. But then it's also giving them the ability to actually tell you what was going on inside of them as they did that. And again, I've told you before, just the amazing responses that I've gotten, even from my 5-year-old, not so much from my 3-year-old, but more so from my 5-year-old, and really their ability to know what's going on inside of them and what caused them to do what they just did. I think that you'll find that your children are much more perceptive and self-aware than you actually give them credit for. And so I would really encourage you, don't miss that. Ask why they did what they did. Don't assume that you know why they did what they did, because if you assume and it's the wrong motivation, then you're going to apply the gospel in a way that's not as potent and powerful to them. So this is really the key to the entire process, is figuring out why they did what they did. Now, they're not always going to be able to articulate that or to know. And so in that case, you can ask them questions that try to, like, was this going on in you? Like, were you thinking about this? Were you upset because, this was your block tower or something like that your brother crashed down? You can ask them questions and try to see if they will latch on to any of those things to help them understand what's going on inside of them. But don't just walk into the situation assuming you know why they did what they did. It's not going to be helpful in the end. So once you've figured out what happened, and once you've understood why it happened, that is what's going on in your kid, the fourth is to help them understand why they did what they did. So they might articulate, I was angry, that's why I hit him. Okay, well, let's talk about what caused your anger, okay? Getting to the root of the problem, and help them understand, again, that their heart is intimately connected with their actions and with their words. So you're helping them understand how their heart is the ultimate problem, not just the way it manifested itself in a given action or language or whatever it might be, words. Fifthly, you want to help them understand why what they did was wrong, okay? And this is the side that we've looked at already of upholding the law. So this is the theological, this one is the theological implication from that third week of our discipline should be aimed at the heart, helping them figure out what's in their heart and getting at their heart. This is the theological implication from last week. We need to uphold the law, the perfect standard of God. We need to show them the law and what it requires so that when we offer them grace and mercy, it's potent, right? They understand that they stand in need of this grace we're giving them. A tip along this line is to use Scripture in your explanation. You want to help them understand that you're not just saying these things and you're not the ultimate authority, but that you stand under an authority that is God himself, right? You're upholding the law of God and showing them how they're not meeting the standard. And you never want your child to just think that you are the ultimate authority over them. You want them to understand that you are submitting to an authority, which is why you're doing what you're doing for a loving purpose. I'll give you a chance to ask questions here once we get through the list. The sixth thing you want to do is, if necessary, if you deem it necessary at the time, discipline them and explain to them why you are disciplining them in the context of it being a warning. Again, we saw this in the theological principles from last week and how discipline should be a warning to them. If you continue to do what was wrong, what we identified here, what God commands is wrong that you ought not to do, and you continue to not seek Jesus for help with your heart, which will lead to more wrongdoing, then this is going to be the result. You're going to live a life of disobedience, and when this life is over, God is going to punish you forever. But he's offering you something here now to help you with your heart. And that's where we move into communicating the gospel to them. Tell them the gospel. And you can be as concise or as elaborate as you need to be. One of the questions I got from my other class when I taught this was, this sounds like a really long process. I don't always have 30 minutes to have a conversation with my kids. Very true. I don't always have a 30-minute conversation with my kids either. There's a time when that's necessary and very good, but we got to realize that we're in different contexts all the time when our kids are sinning, and we can't always give that kind of time to it. The one thing I would say is the more full-fledged conversations you have with them builds a good foundation. When you're utilizing and using that consistent language, when you're helping them understand these realities, then you can abridge it into like a 2-minute conversation when you're in the grocery store. Or when you say, like, the way you're acting right now is really showing me your heart. They immediately import conversations that you've had with them previously into what's going on within them. And some of my conversations with my kids are as simple and as concise as, you're really showing your heart right now. It's not honoring to God. It's very disrespectful to mommy and daddy. You need to seek Jesus' help with your heart. And maybe giving them the opportunity to do that wherever you are, or just making them aware of that reality. And again, you might not see fit to discipline them in that moment, or you might see fit to discipline them in that moment. Depends where you are contextually and things of that sort. And so basically, doesn't always have to be a 30-minute conversation, but those are extremely helpful to have, so have them when you can. An extra tip in terms of telling them the gospel is to communicate two things to them, both the general gospel message and the heart-specific application of the gospel to them. So communicating the gospel generally speaking to them and what Jesus came to do and what he did, and then specifically trying to apply the gospel to where their heart was disoriented. If that's confusing to you, we'll see it play out here in a moment. And then eighthly, you want to walk them through confession or asking Jesus for help. So you want to figure out who did you hurt? How did you hurt them? Is your heart ready to talk to them about it? So if one of my kids hit my other kid and I'm working with them and I get to the point of this, I'll ask them, who did you offend? Who did you hurt with this whole thing? Well, I hurt my brother. Yeah, you hurt your brother. Who else did you hurt? You hurt God. You disobeyed God. You were unloving and unkind, and God commands you to be such. Who else? Well, I hurt you. Well, yeah, because you disobeyed my command to not hurt your brother, right? And so you have to work your children through the process of seeking God's forgiveness, seeking your forgiveness, and seeking the forgiveness of all those whom he has offended. And this really helps hold him accountable to the reconciliation in those relationships. One of the things I have told people before is that I don't force my kids to say they're sorry. I work with them to the point, and that's what this line is about right here. Because in my mind, a unsincere apology is a not only worthless apology, but actually a damaging apology. Because it communicates to our children and to the people who they're apologizing to that you're not worth a legitimate apology. That you're devaluing the people that you're apologizing to if you don't mean it. And it's also not helpful to force our kids to do that because it also communicates to them that they don't have to be genuine in their apologies, that this is just some act that we're doing. And so there will be times when I don't force my kid to say they're sorry, and I work with them, and I'll just like, if we pray and we ask Jesus for help, and I say, is your heart in the right place to go reconcile what happened? And they say no. Maybe we need to talk to Jesus again. Maybe there needs to be discipline again. And again, just realizing, helping them understand that that's not the right heart posture, that if we're truly trusting in Jesus and resting in him, he's going to give us that desire to reconcile relationship. And so there will also be times when my kid just continually says no, they're not ready. And the process will stop eventually. And I'll say something like, that really shows me where your heart is. And allow them to sit on the reality of what's going on inside of them and their unwillingness to make it right with the people who they've hurt should be a powerful and potent reality in the lives of our kids. And I think that that's a more healthy direction for them to sit in that reality, and maybe you revisit the conversation later. You're then able to either revisit it later and help them work through that, or it just becomes an ongoing difficulty. And it becomes something that you can continually point back to, as this all stemmed from that situation, right, where you were unwilling to reconcile. There are consequences for not doing that. And so typically, at least with my kids, they're very hesitant to reconcile with people that they're not comfortable with. So if they've hurt a friend or something that they're not super comfortable with, like with me or my wife or any of the siblings, they're really comfortable to just go and say something. But I've had more times when it's been an in-law or something like that, and they're hesitant to apologize. And one of the things that's really helpful is to help them work through why you're hesitant to do so. There's been times when that's happened. I'd be like, why don't you want to say you're sorry? You should want to say you're sorry. And they're just you can see it in their face, you can see it in their eyes. There's just shame, written all over them. That somebody that they care about, that they've hurt. And they feel embarrassed by what they've done. And having to have the humility to go out and confess that and ask for their forgiveness is an extremely humbling reality. And so you then have the ability to, again, engage with them about those things that are going on inside of them, even in the confession side as well. Okay, ninthly and lastly, pray again. Not both pray with them and walking them through this confession and helping them walk through it with the relationships that they have with who they've hurt, but then also you praying again as a parent that everything you just talked about, the Spirit of God will use to change and transform your children, that the gospel you've preached to them will take root in their heart, and that the Spirit would be pleased to move within them. Okay, any thoughts or questions as to the process as a whole here? Yeah. Yeah. So for me personally, I don't ever want to leave my child in a state of thinking that they are in and of themselves okay, that they're good, that they are in and of themselves honoring to God, that the things that they're doing are honoring. I don't ever want to try to increase in them this thought that they are okay in and of themselves, if that makes sense. And to me, that demands then that we continually keep before them their sinfulness and their need for Jesus and grace. And I think that if you're consistently communicating both realities of your sinfulness and your heart problem and your need for Jesus to change you, then you have the ability to, in the manifold ways that the Bible does, show how beautiful Jesus is, how willing and able he is to help them, and to really supply the grace side. I think when both of those things are working together, like, yeah, we can in frustration just be like, you're a wicked little sinner and God's going to judge you, and then just like go on with the rest of our day. That's probably not going to be super helpful, right? Like in our frustration, we might want to do that. But I think when we hold both realities together, both of the law and of the gospel, that it's a very beautiful thing for our children. That again, going back to a couple weeks ago, it should produce a freedom in our children to seek Jesus' help to change, rather than just leaving them with the law and them feeling pressured to change themselves. And I would say too that like shame and guilt, fear, those are good things when you're talking about your relationship with God and how it's been distorted and how it's been marred. Shame and guilt and fear are things that tune you into that reality, that you're separated from God. And so that shame and guilt and fear should be things that you're trying to talk to your children about. You should be ashamed of what you did, because it's a shameful thing as God has said it. But you know what? Jesus can take away that shame. Jesus can take away that guilt. And so again, just continually supplying the gospel and the grace side, I think is very helpful for our kids. Rather than, in my mind, the opposite is not dealing seriously with their sin and therefore leaving them in a state of callousness and comfortability to it, or possibly being afraid of, I don't think that the answer on the other side is sufficient, both because I don't think it's biblical and because I don't think that it holds the power that communicating the law and gospel to them does. Any other thoughts or questions?
So, you use this process, so say it's more a sin of like, or maybe not a sin, it's a good word, but like, okay, so like, you're supposed to make your bed every day.
Mhm.
They just don't. They know the rule, they just let it go.
Right.
You tell them, put on your shoes 2 weeks a day. They just don't. It's just they didn't say it. I mean,
Yeah, so again, like contextually, you can determine how you want to handle any given situation and how long the conversation needs to be. But think about it this way. If you've given a command to your child and they neglect doing it, they've neglected doing it, or they purposefully not done it for a reason. And again, kind of going back to like the second week when we're talking about the sinful state of our children, although not putting on your shoes when I tell you to put on your shoes, in the grand scheme of things, is really not a big deal, right? Not cleaning your room when you know you're supposed to clean up your room in the morning is not really, in the grand scheme of the world, a big deal. But whatever is causing them in their heart to not do that or not want to do that, when they grow older, is going to manifest itself in other more serious ways. And I think that that's what we're trying to get at, and see that, no, my kid not putting their shoes on is not a huge deal, but what caused them to not put it on is a huge deal. Because the more we grow in independence, the more your children grow in independence from you, the more they're going to have that freedom to do whatever their heart desires. And that whatever it was in them, that lack of desire to listen to your authority, is going to have massive authority implications for them in the future, because it's what's coming from the heart. And that heart posture towards your authority, if that's the issue, is going to manifest itself in authority issues later in different ways. Perhaps in listening to their employer and doing what their employer asks, or being a law-abiding citizen, or whatever it might be. But ultimately, it's indicative of the way that they view God's authority over them, because God has put you in authority over your child. And so, again, it's, I'm not saying both those things have happened in our house frequently. I'm not saying that that means you have a 30-minute conversation with them, because you got to get out the door. You're trying to go. You got to get to church, right? But it might be an abridged or shorter conversation with them on the car ride, or whatever it might be. The point is that we're taking those opportunities to get to their heart. And again, this is a very cumbersome and weary process as a parent to do this consistently, which is why in 2 weeks we're going to talk about the necessity of prayer for us as parents to do it well and to do it as best we can. Okay, if you have other questions, just kind of jot them down and we'll try and deal with them later. I want to move into the first scenario with the time that we have left. So what I'm going to do is hand you one of these, and it presents on the top. It presents on the top the scenario that we're going to consider. And now I'm just going to give you a couple minutes. It's not going to I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to kind of think through the way you might address what's going on in the situation. So here's the situation. Jake, okay? What happened? I've given you this information. Jake hit his brother Ben because he crashed Jake's tower down. So Jake was building a tower, Ben crashed it down, Jake socks him, right? So you figured it out, you've come into the room, this is what's happened. Now, why did Jake do the above? We're getting at his heart. Jake hit his brother because he was angry that he crashed his tower down, okay? But that's not the extent. Anger is still just a symptom. Jake became angry because he values his tower more than his brother. Now, whether Jake is able to articulate that to you or not, depending on the age of your kid, he might be able to. That's a pretty obvious reality. He valued his tower more than his brother, which is why he thought he could hit his brother when he crashed his tower down. So now you guys just take a couple minutes and work through, think through. You don't have to, if you want to jot stuff down, you can. The rest of the process and how you would handle Jake becoming angry because he values his brother's tower more, or he values his tower more than his brother. So just take a couple minutes to think through that, and then I'll walk through how I would handle it. Okay, I know that was really short. I want to make sure I get through this. If you're like, man, you're just like spraying me with a fire hose here, we're going to have a whole nother week dedicated to the same thing with 2 other scenarios next week. So just bear with me if you're like, man, I don't understand what's going on here. Let's slow down a little bit. We'll have time for that again next week. So you've prayed, you figured out what happened. Jake hit his brother Ben because he crashed Jake's tower down. Why did Jake hit his brother? We're getting at the heart. Jake hit his brother because he was angry that he crashed his tower down. Anger's still a symptom. Why did he get angry? He got angry because he values his tower more than his brother. Okay? And this is the heart problem. This is the heart disorientation that's going on inside of Jake. So help them understand why they did what they did. Utilize Scripture. So I would talk to Johnny about his hitting his brother and how it was fueled by his anger, right? This is what led him to hit his brother. And this anger was stirred up because of his heart disorientation. I realize that's a big word. You can simplify it for little kids, but their heart was not valuing the right things, right? Their heart was valuing their toys over their relationship with their brother, which led them to take bad action sinful action against their brother. Now, you want to point out Matthew 12:34 to them, and this is one I talk about all the time with my kids. From the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Connecting their heart to their actions, right? We want to help them understand why they did what they did. Not only this, we want to help them understand why what they did was wrong. Again, we want to utilize Scripture here. We're upholding the law, so let's utilize the Word of God as we do so. So the fact that Johnny values his toys over his brother is wrong because his brother is more valuable than his toys. And God has told us this, right? Genesis 1:27 has talked about how he made man in his own image. That Johnny's brother has intrinsic value that toys or created things don't have. Animals, he's got value that animals don't have. He's got a value that toys or inanimate objects don't have. God has placed a greater value on your brother than on your toys. And for you to not work and understand that reality and live in light of it is wrong. Not only this, but his relationship with his brother should be more important to him than his toys, right? Now, it's definitely wrong that Ben knocked his brother's tower down, which we're going to talk about him next week, right? Because we've got two sinners here in this scenario. We've got Jake and we've got Ben. But regardless, we're dealing with Jake right now, and you should value your relationship with your brother more than your toys. Philippians 2:3 and 4. Considering others more significant than yourselves, right? And so we see here how we should value this person because of his intrinsic value, and also the relationship more than we value the toys. Helping Jake to understand these realities as simply as you can. Jake. So Jake acting here on his anger by hitting his brother is also wrong because it is unkind and unloving. And Jesus has clearly commanded us to love one another as he has loved us, right? The greatest commandment, John 13:34. So you've utilized some scripture, you've upheld the law of God to them, and they've now seen how desperately short they've fallen of God's law, right? So now you talk about discipline. What kind of discipline will you administer, if any? How will you explain it to your child? This may be an appropriate time to remove the toys. Okay? This is what we talked about earlier, Julian. Now, word of caution, if you remove the toys as a disciplinary action, do not use them as a way to control his behavior. What this would look like is this. I'm taking these toys away from you. You can have them back when right? You can have them back when you've apologized to your brother. You can have them back when you've served your punishment or your time. This is communicating to them, again, a selfish motivation for getting their blocks back. I'm not really sorry that I hit my brother, but I'm going to go say I'm sorry so I can get my blocks back, right? This is the way that we're using the discipline in order to control their behavior. So this is not helpful for our kids. So this discipline here of removing something from them is to warn you of the grace of God that will no longer be accessible to you should you continue to reject Jesus. Okay? That's the reality that we talked about earlier. So how does the gospel address their heart? This is the next section, preaching the gospel to them after you've disciplined them. First, we have a general gospel explanation, which I use repeatedly using the same language. God is angry and hurt by what you've done, but God sent his son to die and rise again so that you could be forgiven and be given a new heart and desires that want to listen and obey him. Okay? So again, we're assimilating that language of their core problem, their heart, with the solution. And Jesus has the power to change your heart, but you got to ask him for that help. And that's the general gospel explanation. That doesn't apply the gospel specifically to his heart. That's just the general gospel, right? So how does Johnny's heart, how does the gospel speak directly to Johnny's heart and his disorientation? or Jake's, I'm sorry. It used to be Johnny and I changed his name and it didn't get changed in my stuff here. We're still talking about Jake, same kid. So Jake's heart priorities or his values are disoriented, as we've seen already. He values his toys more than his brother. So how does the gospel, the person and work of Jesus, address this? We see in Jesus proper heart priorities. In Philippians 2, 5, and 7, we see how Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but humbled himself for the sake of others, valuing other people. He became like us, giving up what he had in heaven, so to speak, in order to come and to help other people. He's valuing people that God have created over what he can obtain in heaven, right? Luke 9:58 talks about how Jesus, the Son of Man, has no place to hide or to lay his head. Jesus roamed around the world in a homeless fashion, completely disregarding all of the physical and material possessions and things that he could have in this life. For what? For people, right? We see in Jesus modeling a correct heart priority to those around us and valuing relationships over tangible possessions, right? These heart priorities can be yours. These heart priorities can be Jake's because of what Jesus has done. He has the power and ability to give them to you, okay? So this is the heart-specific gospel explanation, and then you call them to believe and to trust in him and to adopt this heart priority that we see in Jesus. Or almost lastly, who did you offend and hurt? How did you offend them? You offended God. Jake dishonored God by hurting an image bearer of his. Jake should seek Jesus for help to get his heart right, to seek God's forgiveness. He's also hurt Ben. Sorry. He's also hurt Ben. Jake was unkind to Ben. Sorry. Jake was unkind to Ben by hitting him. Jake should seek Jesus' help to get his heart right, to seek Ben's forgiveness. And so again, we're just rooting this entire process in seeking Jesus' help and trying to strive to help our children understand how there's a spiritual reality going on here, where we're upholding the law for them, we're getting at their heart, we're upholding the law, and then we're communicating the gospel to them to help make all the connections for them. We have to conclude because people are going to start coming in here soon. So if this was utterly confusing to you, again, we're going to have a whole nother week going over 2 other scenarios. Think about what we've talked about, reread it. I'll have this recorded. If you want to re-listen to it, let me know. And then come with questions for next week as we begin, and then we'll talk about some of those before we consider the other scenarios. Okay.